Hi, welcome back to this third section in the course about Christmanship, the ethics of competition. Now, we've been through the overview of theology, we've been through an overview, kind of a review, both of these, of competition, and now we're going to move into what we call biblical hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics is a Greek word, as you might imagine. And as we go into this, remember, you've got to be taking exam quality notes for this course, if you're taking it for credit. If you look at the second slide, you're going to see a statue there that guards the gateway into ancient Corinth. And this statue was to the Greek god Hermes. Now, Hermes was a god that flew around and delivered messages. Zeus would say, go over to my long-suffering wife Hera, or over to this guy or that guy, and give this message to him. And so then Hermes would go and interpret the message. And therefore we call how we interpret the Bible hermeneutics. No, it doesn't have anything to do with the Greek god, but that's just where the word hermeneutics comes from. Obviously, Hermes was a mythological god. So, we get it from him, but let's talk about it and talk about the important concepts. And I'm going to give you what Luther said, and again, this is Latin, Sacra Scriptura. Sacra Scriptura. And this is simply meaning that Luther said that Scripture is to be interpreted by Scripture. Scripture is its own interpreter. Now, this is one of the key important concepts of hermeneutics. If we come to a particular verse and it's troublesome and we can't quite figure it out, then we don't go to something outside of the Bible to help interpret it. We go to the Bible itself. What do other verses, what do other passages teach us about the Bible, about that hard verse? We'll break this out a little bit as we go. If you go to your fourth slide, this is another important concept, and it is exegesis, eisegesis. And again, Greek words. To go into is to eisegete. We go in, as opposed to getting out of, exit. And even at the doors, even of this studio that I'm in, there's an exit sign that says, this is the way out. So when it comes to Scripture, what this basically means is, do you take what's in the Scripture and have it come out to influence you? That's exegesis, out of Scripture influencing you. Or do you take what's in your mind, in your heart, in your will, and you put it into Scripture? That you want the Scripture to say something, and so you're going to just search and search and search until you can find something in the Bible that might actually say what you want it to say. It probably doesn't, by the way, but you're going to find one because you're going to twist it and turn it. This is hugely important. We can't put into Scripture what we want God to say. We can't tell God what we want. Now, yes, we can. That's called prayer, and we should always be willing to tell God what we want. But that's different than receiving from God out of His Word what He wants for us. So, one of the major rules of biblical hermeneutics, interpreting the Bible, is to allow the Bible to interpret itself. Last slide. This slide is that we take out of the Bible, we don't put into the Bible. Now, if you go to the fifth slide, there's some things here that we need to talk about because it helps us interpret the Bible. Phenomenological language. Don't try to say that quickly 5 times. But what that basically means is what we see in the phenomenon around us. Okay, what's an example of that? How things look to the eye. In other words, we don't accuse the weather person of saying, person doesn't know what they're talking about, they're crazy, when they say the sun will rise or the sun will set or the moon will rise or set. We know that it doesn't actually set. or rise, but that's what it looks like to our eyes. And so we're going to be okay with those weather people when they use that terminology. We're not going to hold that over them and say they should be fired from their job. Similarly, in these kinds of areas, let's just allow the Bible to have that same license, if you will. Another one of these is round numbers. Round numbers. My mother said this, and this is when it maybe was true, because she said, "I've told you 1,000,000 times." Yes, my mother probably had to tell me 1,000,000 times, but most mothers, it's a round number, and it's meant for some sort of a emphasis, strengthening what they're trying to say there. And so what we have to understand in this is that let's just take the Bible for what it's worth, and that there's a lot there when we're using those round numbers. The hyperbole. Basically, I live in the Hall of Fame city, where every year the Hall of Fame, Football Hall of Fame, has this massive festival. Goes on for 2 weeks, and literally hundreds of thousands of people come to our city. And the paper writes, all of Canton came out to see the Hall of Fame ceremonies. Do we believe that? It's hyperbole. It's hyperbolic. Do we actually believe that every person on a respirator came out of the hospital and went to that? No, but we do understand that it was largely attended by a lot of people. Let's allow the Bible the same freedom. Metaphor. Jesus says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. I'm the good shepherd." Was he actually a vine, and are we branches? Metaphorically, yes. Realistically, no. Allow the Bible to have this metaphoric ability. And the anthropomorphic, meaning what's it like to be a human, language. He said, "I am the door." Was he a door? Well, spiritually, yes. But not like the door that blocks people from coming in and out of this studio. Okay, now, let's go a little bit more into this. And you're going to begin to see in the 7th slide the rules of interpretation. The rules of interpretation. The first one is the literary genre. I just kind of went over with you. Metaphor, simile, poems, personification. Allow poems to be poems. Allow metaphors to be metaphors. So let's allow the Bible to do the same thing that any of us would do. That's the first rule. Understand the literary genre and then begin your interpretation there. The second one is that we want to interpret the implicit by the explicit. In other words, there's a scripture that has Jesus quoted as saying, "You will have the poor with you always." Now, this is in a teaching that Jesus is not talking explicitly about the poor. He is teaching more about loving someone. He's teaching about how to be generous, how to be maybe even over the top in your expression of your love. This was about the woman who came and broke the ointment over his feet and washed his feet and caressed his hair, and that these are expressions of great love and outpouring. And the disciples said, "Well, that could have been sold and given to the poor." And he said, "You have the poor with you always, but you will not always have me." And we just need to understand that this passage is explicitly teaching about celebration and bestowing love, not about the poor. And yet, now let's go back to Luther, interpreted Scripture by Scripture. We can't take this implicit statement about poverty and the poor and say we don't have to worry about the poor. No, we can't, because the Bible is overwhelmingly filled with these passages that explicitly teach about caring for the poor. So don't let the implicit verse interpret the explicit. And the second one is like this, the obscure by the clear. The obscure passage that comes in 1 Peter 3:19 and following about Jesus going into the netherworld and preaching to those, that's kind of a obscure passage. And we need to be interpreting that by the clear passage that Jesus died, was crucified, he was dead, he was buried, and he was resurrected. He came back to life and he ascended to heaven. Those are very clear, well attested to. So let's don't make a whole lot of doctrinal statements on these obscure passages. The fourth one is the narrative by the didactic. Narrative is a story. The didactic is thus saith the Lord. So here's the criteria on your slide about determining what is a narrative. And I'll let you read through that. I'm not going to go over it right now. It's self-explanatory. But it's very specific. But one of the main things about the narrative is that it doesn't have an obvious moral or spiritual input. That's the narrative. It's just a story. So how this is related is that we have to figure out, do the people in the story do the right thing or the wrong thing? Just because they did it doesn't mean we're supposed to do it, even though it's in the Bible. For instance, I know you believe this, or else you wouldn't even be here watching this video. Because you would have, when the scripture said, Judas went and hung himself, because he did that, and it's in the Bible, you would go hang yourself. So I know you don't believe that everything that a person does in the Bible we're supposed to do. It's a story. It's a narrative. Now, did Judas do the right thing or the wrong thing? Obviously, he did the wrong thing a few times. Thus saith the Lord, you shall not kill anybody, including yourself. So you see where the didactic is informing the narrative. So whenever it's a story, we interpret it by the teaching, the clear teachings. Let's go on to 5, 6, and 7. Make sure you have the right definitions. When it was written, not when it is today. And if I was to say that I went and had a gay old time in the 1890s, you would say I rode a large wheel, one-wheel bicycle, or I played croquet on a back lawn. If I said it in the 1990s, you would think of it quite different gay. And not making any comments or statements about gay, we're just saying that the word has changed. We need to get the definition. The sixth one is that the general by the specific. So God says that He wills for everybody to be saved, and that's true. But then there are other specific ones about who will be saved. And so we need to take the general by the specific. The laws of logic. The Bible's logical. We can't just say we throw it all out. And so make sure that when we're looking at interpreting the Bible that we get logic into this. The eighth one is a very key one, and it is the a priori. What is the overwhelming message about this particular thing in the Bible, like poverty and the poor? Overwhelmingly, it's that we're to care for the poor. Now, how we're to care for the poor is not as always well defined, but we are to care for them. And so that little verse that Jesus said, you have them with you always, the a priori of the Bible rules that one out all the way. Parallelism. This would be on your 12th slide, and it's your 9th rule of interpretation. When there are two or more phrases in close proximity, this is oftentimes found in the Proverbs or in other poetry. And two lines that say the same thing in different ways. Proverbs 19 says, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he who speaks lies shall not escape. You see how that's similar? Saying the same thing but in different ways. Contrasting two lines that are very different. Proverbs 14:10, with pride comes contention, and from humble wisdom comes well-doing. All right? You see how we have to grab hold of some of those parallelisms to help us understand these things. And that can often be a help in some of the trickier places. And then I'm going to wrap up with the last two. The 10th one is a biblical hierarchy. We start with Thus saith the Lord, 10 Commandments, Sermon on the Mount, the teachings in the epistles. Thus saith the Lord. Casuistic, this is case law. That would be places like Leviticus. And it's somewhat like this. If this happens, then do this. It's always if then. And then the next one is general wisdom. And then the last one is custom. So what we find here is that Thus saith the Lord is pretty clear about what we need to do. But there are some things that aren't quite as clear, or we need a stronger definition. So like, thou shalt not murder. That's didactic. It's apodictic. It's 10 Commandments. Thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not commit murder. But is abortion murder? Is killing in war murder? Is executing a life sentence, and taking the life of a prisoner? They got the death penalty. Is that killing? Is that murder rather? They're killing. They're all killing, but are they murder? That's where we need case law. Case law is going to help us understand where that is murder and where it's not. And then, if we're still not sure that there's no case law, then we have to go with general wisdom. That includes logic. So in the case of abortion, we would have to find a very, very strong biblical mandate to show us where abortion is not murder in order for us to say this. Because it's not one of the 10 Commandments. It's maybe suggested in some of the Levitical casuistic case law things. But if nothing was done, that embryo is really a person that comes to full life. So case law gives way to general wisdom at some points, and then there's obvious custom when there's nothing that really is anti-biblical or biblical, but it's just the way that people do things in that culture. Then we want to go by that and honor that. So to wrap this all up, again, whole courses are taught on hermeneutics, and all we're trying to do is give you some basics in this course to help us as we get into the ethics of competition. So this is preparing us for what we're going to do in trying to interpret the Bible to know what we can do in sport and what we can't do and how we can glorify and can't. I'm Dr. Greg Linville. Thanks for joining us for this time with the Agone Institute.